What's up? Welcome to our lab on pollination syndromes. I love this lab. This is a great way to kind of explore the overlap between like animal evolution and plant evolution in a way that's called coevolution. So the evolution between two things. We've already talked about these different stages of life, from like molecules to macromolecules, the molecules that are involved in genetics and evolution, tissues, organ systems, organisms. We've even talked about ecology. So pollination syndromes is a great way to kind of button up a lot of these conversations and look at flowers and try to predict what the pollinators would be based on the floral characteristics. It's super fun, and when you're going for a casual walk now after this class, you'll be able to look at a flower and predict what the pollinator might be even without even seeing the animal there. Before we talk about animal pollinated flowers and the coevolution of flowering plants and their pollinators, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that not every plant is animal pollinated. A lot of things are pollinated by things like wind and water. This is a gymnosperm. Remember, these are a group of plants that's separate from the flowering plants. They create these things called strobili, remember, like cones, male and female cones. And these male cones, they produce pollen in like huge quantities, right? And so they'll produce this pollen at the tips of the branches, and when the wind blows, they just dump this pollen out. And there's tons of pollen everywhere. There's videos of this stuff. It looks like a cloud, right? And it gets everywhere. It gets in your sinuses and causes allergies. It gets on, the landscape. It doesn't really do anything. It's like a kind of a waste of energy for the plant. And so it works out, obviously, for a lot of gymnosperms, why they're around. To deliver your pollen through an animal pollinator is such an efficient way to distribute your pollen through the landscape. That's kind of why the flowering plants have such an advantage and have had such a big radiation and now a dominance over a lot of landscapes, is because they've kind of solved this little problem and made animals kind of do their work for them. When you're trying to predict a pollinator, there's basically three different things you can look at in a flower's structure to kind of make that prediction. You can look at the color, the way it's like visually attracting something. You can detect whether or not something has some kind of scent or some kind of like chemosensory attractant, and then try to figure out what organism might be attracted to that. And then the third thing is like the rough size and the structure of the flower. Is there anything that's like enabling a pollinator? Is there something that's limiting another kind of pollinator? So I'll kind of unpack that a little more. So here you have a plant that has a flower that is red. Red tends to be something that attracts birds. But there's another thing that's lacking on this flower, and that's somewhere to perch. So there's nowhere for a bird to actually land on this flower. That means if a bird is going to pollinate it, it has to be hovering. So whatever bird is pollinating this flower has to hover. What kind of bird hovers? It's like a hummingbird, right? Another example, this is a dried up flower, but this is a really small and usually red flower that is very sweet. It comes from this flower here, and it's like on a long stalk. Again, there's nowhere to perch, but these little flowers are most often pollinated by things like birds. So that's like an example of flowers that have no structure to facilitate like the landing of something, right? So the thing pollinating has to hover. So this is also a bird-pollinated flower, but this is a little different than the other bird-pollinated flowers that we were looking at. The other bird-pollinated flowers we were looking at had tubular flowers, and they were hanging, and they had nowhere for the bird to perch. And that's because a lot of the birds that are here in the New World that pollinate are things like hummingbirds, and those birds can hover, right? So they don't need somewhere to perch. Well, this flower is not from North, Central, or South America. It's from another part of the world where there are no hummingbirds. There's no birds that can hover like that. And so to be pollinated by a bird, this flower has to have a landing platform strong enough for a bird to land. So this is Strelitzia. You probably heard of bird of paradise. They call it bird of paradise, but essentially this part of the flower, this bract here, is strong enough where a bird can land on it and then go to work collecting nectar, thereby pollinating the flower. And so you can see that it's colorful and it's got a lot of nectar, and the size makes sense for a bird pollinator. but this extra kind of support would suggest that this is pollinated by a bird that can't hover. So something like a sunbird. So these flowers are pollinated by things like butterflies and bees. And you can see there's actually a little platform. There's a place for the insect to land and to start to collect nectar and to actually pollinate the flower. This isn't like a huge flower. So if a bird landed on this, it's not going to work out. So you kind of can estimate the size of the butterfly, the size of the organism that's going to be on this. So I would predict that something like this is generally pollinated by insects, a lot of butterflies, maybe bees, and maybe even like beetles and small flies. Things like that can also carry pollen from plant to plant. Another hint as to what the pollinator might be on a flower is the shape of the corolla, or the shape of kind of the entry point where the nectar is delivered or made available. Here you can see a flower with a long tubular shape, and so whatever is pollinating this likely has some way of accessing that nectar through this like tubular shape of a flower. Well, this is a smaller flower, and it's pink and lightly scented. You'd be correct in guessing that this is pollinated by something like a butterfly or a bee or something like that. But butterflies also have a proboscis. They have an appendage that access nectar deep down, but it's not super obvious until you remove one individual flower. And you can see that this little individual flower has that long tubular shape for a proboscis to access that nectar, but it's a lot smaller. And so that size difference will help you kind of guess as to what the pollinator might be. Whatever's pollinating this has a proboscis or a beak this long, and whatever's pollinating this has something much smaller. So this is probably a smaller organism, probably an arthropod like a butterfly or a bee, and this is probably a vertebrate like a bird. And the fact that it's red also gives you a good hint that it's a bird-pollinated flower. Another thing that kind of helps you distinguish between possible pollinators is color. Colored flowers are usually pollinated in the daytime. Flowers that are pollinated at night are usually white. I think this is a pretty good example of a flower that is white, so it's probably night pollinator, it's probably night nocturnal pollinator. It's tubular, right? So whatever's pollinating it probably has like a proboscis or something like that, can enter the flower and get the nectar from within the flower. And then there's nowhere for it to land. And so this is most likely a moth-pollinated tree. And it's also lightly scented, but in the daytime, you'll probably still see insects visiting it, because it's not like there's like a limitation. Insects can't visit it, and it won't be pollinated unless it's a moth. Anything that pollinates it will pollinate it, but the tendency, the evolutionary trend, is towards supporting a moth pollinator and having that as its moth pollination syndrome. This is a vine called Salandra maxima, and this is a vine that's native to southern Mexico, some tropical regions in Central America. And Salandra maxima has these really big, kind of trumpet-shaped flowers. Now, based on kind of what we know about the size of a flower, the color of a flower, and the way it creates scent, or has or doesn't have a platform, we can start to make some guesses as to what the pollinator might be on this flower. So there's nowhere for anything to really perch. It's light colored, so it's probably a nocturnal pollinator. And you can't tell from the video, but this has a sweet scent, and it gets stronger at night. And so it's probably a vertebrate. So if you can think of something, maybe make a guess right now, like a medium-sized vertebrate that can fly, that can hover, that flies at night. Whatever you're thinking about might be the pollinator. And if you're thinking about a bat, you're probably right. A lot of these bat-pollinated flowers have these trumpet shapes because bats can hover, and they'll get in there and they'll root around for nectar. And when they're doing that, they'll rub these anthers and they get this pollen on their faces. They go to the next flower, and then that pollen will land right here and go down the flower and fertilize the ovule down there. We learned about that a few lectures ago. But oftentimes the flowers that are pollinated by vertebrates, by mammals, are really strong, because mammals tend to be pretty forceful when they're like rooting around getting nectar. And And so these are tough flowers. They're like almost leathery, and they're kind of big and beautiful. Another great example of like a bat pollinated flower is the baobab tree, and those are from Africa. Those have these huge pendant white flowers that hang hundreds of feet in the air, and bats fly up and they enter the flower, they root around for nectar, and then they leave, and those flowers are big and strong and tough to handle that. So this one might throw you for a loop. It's got some things that will help you figure out what the pollinator is, but there's some things that might throw you off. So this is a flower that is red. That should, right off the bat, give you a hint as to what the pollinator is. It's not super obvious, but the nectar is made available inside the middle here in the corolla. And whatever goes in here rubs on these anthers and pulls the pollen off. This actually makes passion fruit, right? So the size of the flower should tell you something about the size of the pollinator. They hang, there's nowhere really to perch. So they sit like this on the vine, and whatever's pollinating them somehow accesses that nectar that way. And while it's accessing the nectar, it's rubbing up here on the anther. So it has to be about that big. So if you can think of something that has a head about that big that can hover and get nectar and likes red, you're probably going to ballpark this guess. But these are usually pollinated by hummingbirds. And these are, because they're pollinated by hummingbirds, you know that they're from where hummingbirds are from, which is North, Central, and South America. So Passiflora, this genus, is actually from North, Central, and South America. And a lot of these have a really tight relationship with their hummingbird pollinators. Some of them are really long, and the really long ones are only pollinated by hummingbirds that have really long beaks. So Passiflora is a great example of a bird-pollinated syndrome.